like to thank everyone for coming out. And as everyone knows, on last Friday, like I said, you all I'm sure watched the news. Our friends at the S&P, the Standards and Poor's, downgraded our credit from AAA to AA plus, which I'm sure doesn't mean much to most people. But nonetheless, this downgrading, which is the first time it's happened to the U.S. since the credit rating system was instituted, this downgrading has caused a backlash on Wall Street and has sort of reignited fears of another recession. Now, personally, I don't think we should really be that really concern ourselves too much or place too much credit on the S&P, care too much what the S&P says about our credit, as these are the same people whose high credit ratings for subprime mortgages helped plunge us into the economic crisis a few years ago. But nonetheless, I think it's significant for a couple reasons. First, we were told by the president, by the Democratic and Republican leaderships and the mainstream media that we had to accept a deal, any deal, no matter how horrible, or just this would happen. In fact, you'll remember that the president got on television and he said roughly that. He said you got to call your congressperson, you got to email, text, tweet, or whatever, to beg them to be reasonable and accept the deal, because if they didn't, we'd default on our debt and they'd downgrade our credit. And as everyone knows, the Democrats and Republicans did come to a compromise deal, which included massive cuts, 2.4 trillion in largely unspecified cuts at this point, to be announced at a later date. They're going to come up through this super Congress or something like this, and the result of all this is that our credit was downgraded anyway. And secondly, I think it's important because we now have a situation where the very phenomenon that they claim they were trying to prevent by passing this compromise bill is now in turn going to be used as an excuse for further cuts in the future. And we can already see this with the S&P, who stated one of the reasons why they downgraded our credit, the main reason they downgraded our credit, is because we didn't have the $4 trillion in cuts that they wanted us to have. And in fact, they added to that a threat, the threat that if we don't have more cuts by next year, they're going to downgrade our credit further. And actually, this sort of economic blackmail is really nothing new for the institutions of international finance capital. I mean, just ask Bolivia or Venezuela or any other poor country, and they'll tell you all about it. But as to the international situation, I also think it's important for us to realize that these budget cuts that are happening to us in the U.S. are not happening in a vacuum. I mean, all throughout Europe, from Greece to Spain, in country after country, we're seeing budget cuts and debt problems. And at the end of the day, these short-term budget shortfalls are a product of the economic crisis. And in all of these countries, the U.S. included, the move on the part of the bosses has been to use make our way out of the recovery on the backs of the working class. And we saw the first expressions of this tendency in the U.S. in Wisconsin through Walker's anti-union bill, and then in Minnesota in the state shutdown, which Dean just talked about. And then in state after state, we see the same thing. We see these attempts at massive cuts, and really these are just brush fires. And the debt ceiling fight was really the beginning of the forest fire, in my opinion. And before we get to talking about the bills themselves, because I think we need to talk about that, what is the debt ceiling? And I'm sure everyone probably knows, but if they don't, I'll just briefly explain that the debt ceiling is set by Congress, and it's sort of the maximum legal amount of money that the government's allowed to borrow to pay its bills. It's been raised 74 times since 1962, 10 times since 2001. That's a tongue twister there. It's technically raised every time Congress passes a spending bill or a tax cut. And basically what any debt ceiling debate amounts to, it's really a debate about whether the government's going to pay its bills or not. But I think what's really interesting, if you paid attention during the debt ceiling debate, is that once you realize that the government and the people to whom they owe money are really representing the same class, it becomes more and more clear the farcical nature of the drama we witnessed the last 2 weeks, or 2 weeks ago. And I actually heard it described. A friend of mine described it as it's if a bank robber walked into a bank with a gun to his head and said, "Give me all the money, or I'm going to shoot," because that's really what we just witnessed. But the media played on people's fears and insecurities from the crisis, and there's a lot of those right now, in order to force through this desperate last-minute deal full of massive cuts. And you can bet that those cuts are going to affect working people like you guys and me more than it's going to affect the bosses, clearly. Now, as for the compromise bill itself, the media has been portraying it as if it's a quote, victory for Republicans or a victory for the Tea Party. And what that obscures, and the implication is obviously that the Democrats offered something qualitatively different, right? But despite all the talk from the president and the Democrats about a more balanced approach, or the lip service they paid to taxing the rich, or the wealthiest Americans should pay their fair share, or whatever euphemism they chose to use. If one looks at the nuts and bolts of the two bills when they were in Congress, the House bill and the Senate bill, there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between them. In fact, there was one Republican representative from Arizona, a guy named Jeff Flack, who, in a moment of candor, actually stated just that. He said, when both bills were in the House, he said, I would actually vote for the Democratic bill if there wasn't a Republican bill in the House at the same time. And I think, aside from all the chest beating that was going on in the 24-hour news networks, I think that's really that was pretty much the case across the board for the leadership of both parties. Now, the Republican or House bill would have consisted of $2.5 trillion in once again largely unspecified cuts, and would have had a ceremonial balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Now, on the other hand, the Democratic bill or the Senate bill it was sort of a bait and switch bill. It had $1.8 trillion in initial cuts, but it also raised the debt ceiling by $2.7 trillion and had a promise that it would raise cuts to match spending. So that means there would have been roughly an additional trillion in, once again, unspecified cuts, which means, believe it or not, at the end of the day, the Democratic bill would have had more cuts than the Republican bill, if you can believe that. There was actually a quote, people's budget also put forward in Congress, which was considerably better than the one put forward by the Democratic Party leadership, but it was entirely ignored. And that shouldn't be a surprise, as the Democratic Party was, as we've already described, more concerned about defending the interests of Wall Street than it was defending the interests of working people. Now, the people's budget would have included a program of public works, cuts in military spending. It would have created a public option, ended the Bush tax cuts, reinstated the estate tax, and eliminated the Social Security loophole. Now, personally, in my opinion, I don't think it went far enough. But that being said, it was far superior to the bill put forward, either the other two bills or the compromise bill that we ended up with, and it actually would have saved more money if that was actually the goal. But it was entirely ignored, and when I say it was ignored, it was completely ignored. The only place the only mainstream references I could find to it were in like the Huffington Post and the Economist magazine, and that shouldn't be a surprise either. I mean, Democrats who want to fight for things like making the rich pay for the crisis, real universal health care, ending the wars, ending Taft-Hartley, and things like this, are always going to be ignored by the media, so long as they subordinate themselves to a big business political party that has, at its foundation, is designed to defend the interests of the wealthy rather than the working majority. And actually, people like Dennis Kucinich or Keith Ellison or other supposed progressive Democrats, Mark Dayton being another example, whether they're well-meaning or cynical, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, they have a certain function in that party. Their function is as progressive cover for the party as a whole. And that's why, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the Campaign for a Mass Party of Labor, it's obviously the need is for labor to break with the Democrats and to form a party of our own. And as to a solution to the debt problem, from a worker's perspective, in my opinion, it doesn't involve any, quote, tough choices. You're always told you got to make tough choices between, on the one hand, higher tax burdens on working families or massive cuts in social spending. We have to have a new way of thinking about the debt. The debt stands at $14.29 trillion, and that's more money than we can even anyone's able to contemplate. That's a lot of money. But we need to remember that debt is not our debt as workers. We didn't make it, and we shouldn't have to pay for it. It belongs to the bosses. I mean, when you talk about social programs like Social Security and Medicare, these make up a comparatively insignificant portion of debt as a whole. And really, social programs and bonds held by workers, poor people, and pension funds are really the only debt that I think we really owe. And more than that, Social Security, despite everything you're told in the media, would be entirely solvent if the loophole that made it so you don't have to pay out anymore after your first $100,000 of income. Because the way it's currently set up makes it so that Social Security is basically funded on the backs of the working class. And as for the money, it's definitely there. The wealthiest Americans, the top 1%, own 42% of the wealth, while the top 10% own 85% of the wealth. I'm sure I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know. And two-thirds of U.S. corporations, 1.2 million companies, paid no taxes from 1998 to 2005. And that's not mom and pop shops either. That 25% of that were large corporations. We're talking about Boeing, Valero, General Electric, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup. The point is that the money is definitely there to fund these programs. And in fact, not only do we have enough resources to fully fund these programs without these massive cuts, but we could actually expand them. We'd actually save money if we expanded Medicare to everyone. But this isn't something, like I said earlier, this isn't something the Democrats or Republicans are likely to do in the foreseeable future because, like I said, they're parties of big business. And big business currently is trying to get out of the crisis on the backs of the working class, and they're not in a position to offer reforms, even minor ones. I mean, the Democrats couldn't even pass a health care bill that included a public option, let alone pass EFCA or anything else that Labor elected them to do. So, in my opinion, that's why Labor needs to break from them and form our own political party, a mass party of labor. So I'll leave it at that.